Do you have to have breakfast? Dr. Walter Longo says you shouldn't skip breakfast. I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome back to another Dr. Westman Reacts. If you don't have my top 10 tips on how to start keto the right way, please look in the description below. Of course, with every video, you want to consider the source. And I have met Dr. Walter Longo once before. We shared the podium at a conference put on by an insurance company. I got to talk to him a little bit. He is a PhD researcher who actually started working with, do you remember back to the biosphere experiment where Dr. Roy Walford and a group of people went in to live inside this biosphere. They were going to eat all of their own, grow and eat all of their own vegetables, and it kind of ended in a murky mess of they didn't have enough food. And anyway, Dr. Walter Longo was there. He told me that he actually opened the door when the experiment ended at the biosphere. So one of the biosphere experiments. So he started with a vegetarian sort of slant, and I still think he has that vegetarian slant, and that's fine. You can be healthy eating lots of different ways. But you have to understand, as a PhD, he's going to be talking about his research, his own personal experience even, growing up in Italy, and then come with some ideas from the research that he has. And I guess he thinks we should all have breakfast. Now, I don't do that very frequently, so let's see if I'm doing it wrong.
If you look at now meta-analysis, so studies containing lots of studies, they indicate very clearly, and not just for overall mortality, but also diabetes, cardiovascular disease, people that skip breakfast have problems. And now you could say, well, they have problems because they have other bad behaviors, right? But then you still have to be surprised. Why doesn't, if you fast, let's say for 16 hours or 18 hours, and you skip breakfast, why doesn't that counterbalance whatever bad habit you may have? You should at least get a neutral effect. But no, we see shortening of lifespan, and we see more cardiovascular disease, and we see association with more diabetes, etc. So that's when you have to say, probably not such a good idea. And if we're gonna skip something, it should not be breakfast. And so, dinner, it's a possibility. I'm a fan of lunch, so I skip lunch. And I've been doing it for 20 years, and I think this seems to be the safest way to go.
Well, let's just stop there. So meta-analyses are studies of studies, and I'm pretty sure that these are meta-analyses of observational studies, meaning they're not randomizing people to, you have breakfast and you don't have breakfast, let's see how you do over time. So, and remember, apples and oranges, meaning the people who are in these studies, these observational studies, are pretty much always eating carbohydrates. So if you're following a low-carb diet, you're one of my patients, these studies really aren't going to apply because our metabolism is different. But now, if you know about Dr. Walter Longo, he's going to be talking about fasting. And fasting means not eating for a period of time, but actually fasting also means fat burning. So when you get up in the morning, you call it a break fast, breakfast, break fast. So you're eating something to break the period of not eating. A lot of people actually go into fat burning or fasting at night. If the youngsters, children are metabolically flexible. Most adults, though, won't. If you're eating carbs at dinner time, you won't go into a fat-burning state by the morning because you're still absorbing those carbohydrates. But if you're trying to get the benefits of fasting, you could not eat for a period of time, or you could not eat carbs for a period of time, because not eating carbs gets you into a fasting metabolism called nutritional ketosis. So I think so far he's talking about, well, his own personal experience that he doesn't have lunch. Great. Now, so my teaching that I do and the way I was taught is that there are a lot of ways to do it. Some people feel great without having breakfast. Some don't have lunch. Some eat 3 meals a day. Some people eat every 2 hours. And so I think there should be flexibility rather than put too much faith in these observational studies. I'm all for not eating so much during the day. I hope he gets into a little more about the quantity and quality of foods rather than just when you eat. We have a boiler, if you will, called a stomach and intestines that hold the food. So the timing of food isn't so important, especially when you're not eating carbohydrates, in my view.
If you consider all the studies out there.
For the longest living groups that are out there that you study and that you look at, in addition to your own trials that you're doing in animals and then observing what happens in human beings as well too, and the trials with them, what do you think is happening when people have breakfast in the morning? Why does it seem to be beneficial? And let's define what breakfast is, because we live in America, and as soon as you say breakfast, people have an idea of pancakes, cereals, sugary stuff. So what do you think is happening on a mechanistic level? And what does these longest living groups, what does their breakfast look like?
Yes, mechanistically, it could be that the fasting, nobody knows, first of all, right? But it's just very consistent. It could be that the fasting, when it gets to too long periods, so for example, we know in people that are at risk for gallstone formation and gallbladder operation, those that fast for 16 hours have twice as much a risk as those that fast for less than 10 hours. So it could be something.
And that's among carb eaters. So keep that in mind, that those studies are among those who eat carbohydrates.
In that domain, for example, what if this continuous generation of lots of fatty acids and lots of ketone bodies is actually a problem? So it could be, right, that it's now pushing the cells all over the body, or maybe some cells, to do something that they shouldn't do. For example,
well, I hear a little hint in there of anti-keto bias there, that actually most of the cells love using fatty acids and ketones, especially heart muscle and skeletal muscle, and even the brain adapts over to using ketones. So there's some old kind of anti-keto bias.
But what about fat accumulation in the heart or in some tissues? Could that be happening, and could that be causing these problems? We don't know. Could also be, in the long run, could it be reprogramming metabolism to make people insulin resistant? So in the short term, you become sensitive, and then in the long run, you become resistant. And so there is lots of these things that are known for other type of dietary interventions. So it is possible that this long fasting period is causing changes that are then detrimental. And then, what is breakfast? Well, again, in these questionnaires, in all these surveys, they just call you up and say, do you have breakfast, yes or no, right? And that's all they ask. And some studies that I remember were looking at how many calories should be in that breakfast. And that I remember 400 calories as being the cutoff point, right? Do you have at least 400 kilocalories or not? Yeah, so that's something that it could be a good range for people to think about. Let's say 300 to 400 calories minimum should be the breakfast. Yeah.
Well, I guess if I have my coffee with some cream in it, I don't always add cream. It might be half and half. Or sometimes at a store, they might put milk in there instead. I don't think I have more than 100 calories for in the morning, and I wouldn't, I guess, call that breakfast. But having cream in the coffee often is what I do, what a lot of my patients do. I remember one patient, I'm taking the history in my clinic at Duke, and I said, and you don't have to have breakfast. And in front of me, right then, this person started crying. And she looked at me and she said, I've never liked having breakfast. And it was really, no one had cried to me with relief that she didn't have to have breakfast anymore. And I wonder if you're that way. If you don't like to have breakfast, don't like the breakfast foods, try without it. It's an interesting thing. You'll still be fat burning. If you're already in nutritional ketosis, there's no harm in not eating in the morning if you're not hungry. And that's one of the principles we use, is if you're hungry, you should eat. If you're not hungry, you shouldn't eat. And I don't know if he's going to be saying So even if you're not hungry, you should have breakfast, because when we survey people and they say they have breakfast, they live longer. And of course, those are carb eaters who are being surveyed. Always remember that in the back of your mind.
So recently I came across this review paper about centenarians and people in their 90s and centenarians, people in their 100. And it was a small paper. It was about like 60 or so people, but it was talking about their sort of classic, sort of salty breakfast they would have in the morning in Italy. And I'm curious, what did you see people eating in Italy when they would break their fast first thing in the morning?
Most people were just having breakfast, a pretty good sized breakfast, nothing like the American breakfast. And breakfast could be yogurt or milk or bread. But I would say that almost everybody I know and everybody that I observed that then became a centenarian, like Salvatore Caruso, who got to 110, the oldest man in Europe, he will have breakfast every morning. And every centenarian that I've ever met will have some form of breakfast every morning. Now, centenarians are also very, probably from everything we see, they're probably a very special group. Meaning that, like Emma Morano, I followed her until she got to 117. And when you look at Emma, I remember this article in the New York Times talking about, eating 3 eggs a day and 150 grams of meat every day.
And no husband. That was also in the title. Eat raw eggs and have no husband was her success for longevity.
Exactly, yeah. So journalists love the stories, but then they don't talk about the real story, which is 6 brothers and sisters they made it over the age of 88. One sister made it to 102. So when you see that, everything is possible, but extremely unlikely that there is not a very strong genetic component. So now we know that, in mice, in our work that we do in Ecuador with growth hormone receptor deficiency, we know that just one single mutation in the genome, in your genes, can make an incredible difference in whether you get diseases or whether you live long or short.
Did you notice that the case they were talking about, this person ate eggs and had meat every day and didn't have a husband? So centenarians are often pulled out as people you want to study, and there's a wide range of what centenarians eat. In the book, in the movie, the blue zones, the people focus on the vegetarian aspects of what these people are eating, but there also are people who are eating lots of meat as well. So I'm afraid the blue zones and centenarian people pull out what they want you to see from those things. And I think there are a lot of ways to be healthy. Keeping the insulin low by however means you do it is probably the mechanism through which how it works, and keeping the calories low. Of course, it was Dr. Longo's initial work with Dr. Roy Walford who promoted calorie restriction, and you never want to take an individual's, one person's experience you don't want to overemphasize it, but for example, if Albert Einstein dies, it doesn't mean his theories don't live on. Dr. Walford actually died at the age of 79 with ALS, which is a terrible disease to get. And he was the one who was promoting calorie restriction for living longer. But of course, you don't want to overemphasize his own personal experience. But Dr. Longo still is kind of pointing to a few anecdotes of the people he knows who have lived a long time, eat breakfast, and looks like they may have had some dairy, some bread for breakfast. I remember in Europe, it would be very common to have cold cuts and cheese, and maybe a hard roll, a very different kind of bread than you might see in the U.S. Certainly no donuts or big pancakes, things like that.
So if you're born with the right genetic makeup, then you could have no breakfast and probably still be okay, right? But that's an extremely rare population. So I wouldn't ever use this 1 in a million cases.
Well, I have to kind of call them out on that. That going from, the anecdotes I have, people eat breakfast in these studies, and so it must be 1 in a million. No, there's really no data to say that if you don't have breakfast, it's 1 in a million that you'll live to 100. That it's kind of disturbing that he uses those numbers pretty loosely in that case.
To tell people what to do and again, most of them did have breakfast, but let's say that some didn't. It's really relevant. Like Emma Morano, 3 eggs a day, 150 grams of raw meat. By the way, Carlo Bava, her physician, gave her the raw meat after she made it to 100 because she was starting to be anemic. And so that's when he intervened, right? So, but you see how the story is very different from the way it was told by the New York Times.
Yeah, even in the New York Times, you were quoted, just paraphrasing, you were saying for every one of these centenarians, we'll see a different story. So we don't want to put too much emphasis in one thing or another that's there.
Everybody's got a story.
The reason that I wanted to bring up breakfast as a topic is that with this explosion, largely due to your research that's there and other colleagues of yours, you have so many more people paying attention to fasting ever than before. I can remember when I first got introduced to the world of functional medicine, was working with a cardiologist in New York at the time and helping him build his, brand and write his books and everything. When we would talk about fasting, this is in the year 2008, still it was not widely known. And you would often have publications that would call an expert or a nutritionist at NYU or somewhere else or Cornell or this place or that, said fasting is dangerous. We have no studies on it. And it was just lack of awareness. And there wasn't as much research that's out there. Now there's way more research that's out there. And generally in America, when most people talk about fasting and them incorporating it into their routine in some sort of way and time restricted eating, they generally are talking about skipping breakfast. So how do you feel about, in one hand, there's this explosion of people talking about fasting, doing fasting, but in another, at least here in America, a lot of people are maybe missing a key component, which is that they're skipping the breakfast piece.
Yes, so this brings me to what I always say in almost every interview. Fasting means absolutely nothing, right? Like eating means absolutely nothing. So what do you eat? How much of it you eat? So eating could be very good for you or very bad for you. And fasting is the same way. So I would say skipping breakfast. If your fasting involves skipping breakfast, you're putting your life at risk. There's no doubt about it.
So I don't agree with that. In fact, that's the language of the, it's dangerous, your life is at risk, that it's not that, you're not on the edge of a cliff ready to fall off. And that is a little bit of a conundrum. And he's known for promoting fasting, which is not eating. And so my view of fasting is it means not eating, or you could do a water fast, which means you're just having water. And then a daily fast, meaning you're eating one time a day, for example, is called intermittent fasting. You might have hours of windows, and it's amazing how detailed some people get into tweaking this idea of time-delimited eating. And then intermittent fasting doesn't mean you change the food itself very much. You might have lots of carbs once a day, and the NIH studies, which look at intermittent fasting and having a meal of carbs every day, these don't work very well for weight loss because there's hunger the rest of the day, and people are unable to really stay strict to the fast. So in my mind, and when I teach a low-carb diet and you're not hungry, great, just eat once a day. But if you are hungry, you should eat during those other times because you're getting the benefits of fat burning. So years ago, we had a conference at SUNY Downstate in Brooklyn, in New York. And some of the old researchers who have passed came to this meeting. It was Richard Veach and Ollie Owen, and George Cahill had already kind of retired by that time. I think this was 2006. And I remember Ollie Owen, Professor Owen getting up. They did some fasting research, really interesting, taking the blood sugars going down to 30 with insulin studies that we probably couldn't do today without careful monitoring. Then Professor Owen got up and said, think of the low-carb diet as fed fasting. And I remember this, we'll never forget it, because fasting means fat burning. And you're probably getting the benefits of not eating fasting when you're eating just a low carbohydrate or keto type of diet. Now, those studies haven't been done. I remember Dr. Longo thinks that you need to have vegetables and pushes a higher carb sort of diet than I do. I would love to see the autophagy and other things that happen during a pure no-food fast compared to when someone is on a low-carb diet in nutritional ketosis, because I think they're going to be getting lots of that benefit of fat burning. of the insulin being low, the anti-inflammatory effects, probably even autophagy, although I don't know that that's been studied directly under keto circumstances. So I have to say I agree that we don't know about long-term fasting, the total effects on people, and I know there are promoters who are pushing the long-term fasting, but you don't only want to do that under medical supervision, especially if you had a medical problem and being on medication. Our sort of mainstream problem with long-term no-eating fasting is the idea that your body may start using its own muscle mass. You might lose lean body mass, and until there are larger studies with hundreds and thousands of people on prolonged fasting, I don't think we have the safety knowledge to know about it. It certainly can work, but it's something that a policy and organization isn't going to endorse until you have more studies about long-term fasting. Well, back to Professor Longo.
Now you could say, well, what if all these epidemiological studies are really catching something else? Yes, it's possible, but this is why you're putting your life at risk. You're not necessarily killing yourself, but the numbers are against you. Let's put it this way.
So again, keep in mind, I really like Professor Longo. I had a great time meeting him and talking to him, but he's not a clinician. So he's saying things that I would never say to you, my patient. That this is killing you, you're putting your life at risk. So that looseness of language is something that a professor can use. A medical doctor can't do that. Or at least I wouldn't want to do that because I need to be more precise with my language.
Then you could have a genetic, you could be genetically predisposed to be fine with skipping breakfast, or you could be doing lots of things that make you live very long skipping breakfast, but you're certainly taking a chance. And so I think it's very important. We got to get away from, I always hear, but all religions have fasting, and so it must be good for you. No, right? There's a lot of things that are out there that are, so for example, most people don't understand that if you fast for very short, you don't even enter a ketogenic state. Let's say,
and how short? Let's
say if you fast less than a day, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not even entering a ketogenic state. But people don't know that if you fast for too long, you're now entering a low metabolic state. So eventually your body, so you have to fast for just the right amount, right? And otherwise you slow down and the body basically detects this very harsh environment. I'm not eating for a long time, so I better save everything I can. And this, we don't know for sure, but probably involves some epigenetic changes. So the body now detecting this harsh environment changes the DNA modifications, and this DNA modification now are telling, slow down, let's try to save as much energy as possible and put it away. And that's exactly what you don't want, right? So now imagine, and we see this in the mouse studies, right? So we feed them a high-fat, high-calorie diet, and then we do the fasting mimicking diet once a month. And after they get off the fasting mimicking diet, they're still burning fat, right? But at some point, if we keep it long enough, they might start doing exactly the opposite. They're still accumulating fat when they shouldn't be accumulating fat. Right? So this, just the same way that maybe epigenetically, we suspect they keep burning fat, epigenetically, you can keep accumulating fat. And so then you have to treat this as a food.
Have you heard that term epigenetics? Epigenetics really just means genetic expression. And it is a term that had to be created because for a few decades, every basic scientist thought genes and your genetic genes you were given were kind of preordained that you would have a certain outcome, when the saying is that, of course, it's genetics and environment that give you the outcome of whatever is going to happen. And so environmental change can change your genetic expression, and that's called epigenetics, and which is a simple way of saying that your genes, just some turn on, some turn off. And yes, food, now he's getting into food as medicine, absolutely. I wish we had all been taught that what we ate really mattered, kind of like going to the gas station. You can't get bad gas, but you can go in and you can get bad food for the human. So what you eat is really important, how often to eat, And whether you should be in fasting or have breakfast, to me, is not, I'm not persuaded by the evidence shown here so far.
Based medicine. And you have to know exactly what it does and when, and then eventually you're going to have to personalize it, right? And not just a fasting mimicking diet, but everything you do with nutrition. So people, for example, think I have a high protein diet that helps me losing weight because maybe I eat less fat, I eat less carbohydrate. But the high protein diet, because the amino acids are controlling the hypothalamus, the IGF-1, the leptin, et cetera, that certain amino acids within the protein diet, if high protein, if you pick a certain type of diet, those can make it very hard for you to lose weight because they're now telling the hypothalamus and the system, again, you should.
Well, but that, again, he's talking from his experience and he's doing a lot of mice studies. In our human studies and in our clinics, you put people on a low-carb keto diet, the hunger goes away even though they're eating protein. So this doesn't apply, again, apples and oranges to, you study people or animals that eat carbs, you may see one thing. You teach someone to not eat carbs, there's a different metabolism going on. You're actually getting the nutritional ketosis, which has the fasting component of fat burning going on. Oh, he mentioned did you notice the idea of the metabolic rate going down, where the body kind of slows down in response? I think that's a normal thing. And in the studies that were done at Harvard by David Ludwig and his group, at least in the short run, any weight loss approach, whether it was high carb or low carb, led to a reduction in metabolism. But there was less of a reduction when they looked at the low carb diet. So there's going to be a reduction in your metabolism when you're losing weight, drawing upon your body fat because your body wants to hold on to it. But that's a normal response. And I mean, you could, as a lot of doctors do, say, well, that is what happens, so we need to treat it or we need to fix it. I'm a little less aggressive. I think you just acknowledge that there's going to be a reduction and you account for that by eating less over time, which then kind of dovetails in with Professor Longo and his mentor's idea of caloric restriction. When you eat a low-carb diet, most people find that they're eating less and less over time, and that the food quality that they are eating when they do eat has gone way up because they're focusing on really good nutrition.
Gain weight, and you should accumulate fat, right? So we're just beginning to enter this nutri-technology world where we go from just food to food controls everything for good reasons, right? So food is at the center of reproduction, is at the center of evolution, right? So it makes sense that it would, as we've shown, control also stem cell, embryonic stem cell like activation and regeneration.
Well, sometimes I think he's too smart. I mean, in a way of how to harness that information for you, the individual, without. So he totally agrees there should be personalization, and finally kind of waffles, pun intended, on whether breakfast should be had or not had, and some people can and some people can't, which is really kind of my conclusion with the teaching that I've received and then the clinical experience that I've had. Some people do great without breakfast, and some people feel like they need to have it, but don't feel like you need to have it just because your mother told you or your father told you years ago. And remember, you don't have to be part of the clean plate club anymore. You don't have to finish everything on your plate. When you're full, you should stop eating. And if you're not hungry, you shouldn't eat. These kinds of simple things make a big difference in terms of habit eating and gratuitous eating in front of the TV, things like that. Well, I'm not convinced that you shouldn't skip breakfast if you're not hungry. Let me know what you think down below. And if you like this, please like it and subscribe so you don't miss out on further videos. If you don't have my top 10 tips on how to start keto right, please look in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.